One question that's often asked about the early Christian period and the evolution of Christian doctrine is whether it's true that these doctrines were shaped by alien ideas that were taken over from Greek philosophy. Now that's been a point that's been argued for at least 250 years in the church. In the 18th century, there were German scholars who were already saying there's an importation of Greek philosophy into the life of the church, and it distorts the way people talk about God. At the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, you have a giant figure like Adolf von Harnack in Germany, arguing that the whole story of early Christian doctrine is a story of the Hellenizing, the making Greek of the Christian world. And I'm not really convinced of this. Of course, early Christian writers took on board a lot of what was being said in the intellectual world around them. They read and reflected on the works of classical philosophers and the commentators on classical philosophy who were contemporary with themselves. They thought in categories that were very largely shaped by that. Of course they did. That was their world. What's most interesting, though, is to see the new things they do with it. So that the doctrine of the Trinity, so far from being the importing of an alien model into Christian thinking, the doctrine of the Trinity is a reflection of what happens when a highly distinctive set of Christian principles meets the philosophical world of ancient Greece. And there's a sort of fusion and an explosion. New vocabulary, new ideas come out of that. And you can see in the 4th and 5th centuries that classical-minded Greek pagans couldn't understand what the church was doing because new ideas kept coming. The way in which you talk about God, the way in which you talk about human beings as well, changed. It's really interesting to see, for example, how in the context of the early monastic movement, when the monks first went to the desert in the 4th, 5th centuries, those people who wrote about their experience in the desert and wrote about temptation and struggle in the desert, fascinatingly, they begin to develop a whole new vocabulary of what it's like to make up your mind. They needed to identify and distinguish different phases or different stages in thinking about the will, what it means to reflect on something you might do, and the difference between just thinking about it and wanting it. And there's 5, 6, or 7 stages in which you might think about something, different levels of identification with your desires. Now all of that is something which is generated within Christianity, with help from a philosophical tradition, but it's not just Christians rolling over and waving their paws in the air when philosophers come along from ancient Greece. They are really doing some new thinking and finding new words. And in some areas, that new thinking is, as many people don't realize, part of that whole reconstructing, turning on its axis of the world that leads eventually to a scientific worldview. The idea that the world we know is shot through with the, what you might call the inner logic of God's own wisdom and God's own mind, so that this is a predictable world as well as a risky world. That certainly is one of the things that begins to move people towards the new understanding that finally matures at the end of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period, that the world is worth exploring, that the mystery of God's purpose is seen in the order of nature as well as in other ways. So I wouldn't buy the idea that we've just been invaded and colonized by Greek philosophy. I think there's something much more imaginative and original going on in Christian thinking.